Susan is the opposite. She never wished to be famous, she wanted to be a singer, and she doesn't conform. She's just a normal person who thought this was her last opportunity.
April 2009. A 47-year-old woman walks onto a British reality TV stage. The audience laughs. The judges roll their eyes. They look at her clothes, her hair, and her age, and they think they've already figured her out. But within 60 seconds, she delivers a vocal performance that doesn't just stun the room, it fractures the internet and changes global pop culture forever. This is the raw, unfiltered story of Susan Boyle's brutal rise, her secret battles, and her ultimate survival. Lately, things aren't looking good for her. From a loud past to a quiet present. Step inside Susan Boyle's childhood home in Blackburn, Scotland today, and the first thing you'll notice is the silence. It's a massive contrast to the absolute chaos that defined her life for over a decade. For a while there, the woman who used to have tens of millions of people hanging on to her every note just completely vanished from the public eye. People started whispering, wondering where she went, and honestly, a lot of fans grew pretty worried that the dream had officially come to an end. But what's actually been happening behind closed doors is a mix of a really scary health battle, pure grit, and a wild reinvention that absolutely nobody saw coming. To get a grip on where Susan is right now, we have to talk about a terrifying day back in April 2022. Out of nowhere, she suffered a massive stroke. It's a nightmare scenario for anyone, but for Susan, it struck right at the core of who she is. The stroke left her with weakness on the left side of her face, and in the ultimate cruel twist, it severely messed up her speech. Imagine your entire identity and livelihood are tied to your voice, and suddenly, you can't even form words properly. Susan kept this completely a secret for over a year, hiding away in a grueling, frustrating period of rehab. She literally had to relearn how to speak, doing repetitive, exhausting vocal exercises in quiet rooms, just fighting to get her pitch back. When she finally walked back onto the Britain's Got Talent stage in June 2023 to sing I Dreamed a Dream, she openly told the crowd that she had fought like crazy to be there. But the comeback wasn't a one-and-done thing. The last few years have been a long, disciplined slog of vocal training and physical therapy just to keep her voice strong. But just when everyone thought Susan was going to quietly settle into a fragile, low-key retirement, she decided to completely flip the script. The woman we all remember wearing sensible, old-fashioned stage gowns just took a sledgehammer to her old image. She recently debuted a total high-fashion makeover. We're talking a sharp blonde bob, giant modern sunglasses, and a luxury fur coat. At 65 years old, she's back in the recording studio, working with modern producers and dropping upbeat, pulsing tracks that are a million miles away from her usual slow ballads. She's proving she's still got plenty of fight left in her. But how exactly did an isolated, fiercely guarded woman from a tiny Scottish town end up in a position to shock the world like this in the first place? The Village of Shadows. You have to look at Blackburn, Scotland, to really understand the woman who stunned the world in 2009. It's a small, gritty, post-industrial town where winters are long and opportunities are short. Growing up there in the 60s and 70s, Susan Boyle didn't exactly have an easy ride. In fact, from the very moment she entered the world, she was handed a pretty rough deck of cards. At birth, doctors mistakenly told her parents that she had suffered oxygen deprivation, leaving her with brain damage. For decades, that was the label pinned to her back. Brain damaged. It wasn't until much later in her adult life that she received a proper diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. But back then, without the right vocabulary or support, Susan was just seen as different. And in a tight-knit traditional village, being different usually meant targets were painted on your back. School was a living nightmare for her. Kids can be brutal, and Susan bore the brunt of it. She was severely bullied, constantly teased for her appearance, her eccentric mannerisms, and the way she processed the world. She later recalled being locked in dark cupboards and called cruel names by classmates who simply didn't understand her. Because of the constant torment, her grades suffered, and she left school with few qualifications. The world was already telling her to shrink, to stay quiet, and to accept a life lived on the absolute margins. But Susan had a secret weapon: her voice. Whenever the world got too loud or too cruel, she would sing. She sang in the kitchen, she sang in the local Catholic church choir, and she sang at karaoke nights in local pubs. Her mother, Bridget, was her biggest champion. Bridget recognized that her daughter had a gift that defied the limitations everyone else tried to place on her. She kept pushing Susan to take risks, even helping her pay to record a small demo tape in her 20s, which Susan sent to record companies and radio stations, only to be met with total silence. As the years rolled on, Susan's world shrank even further. Her siblings grew up and moved away, leaving just Susan and her aging mother in their modest council house. Susan became Bridget's primary caregiver, putting whatever small dreams she had on the back burner to look after the woman who had always protected her. It was a quiet, insular existence. Susan rarely left Blackburn. She didn't date, and her social life was mostly confined to church and her beloved cat, Pebbles. Then came 2007, the year Susan's world completely shattered. Bridget passed away at the age of 91. The loss was devastating. Susan didn't just lose her mother. She lost her anchor, her protector, and her only real connection to the outside world. For days, Susan couldn't even bring herself to leave the house, trapped inside by overwhelming grief. Neighbors had to check on her, worried she would completely waste away in that quiet house. She was 45 years old, entirely alone, and surviving on unemployment benefits. It looked like the end of the line, a tragic, quiet life, destined to be forgotten. But right before her mother died, Susan had made her a solemn promise. She promised she would do something with her voice. She promised she would take a chance. 2 years after that devastating loss, fueled by grief and a promise to a ghost, Susan finally decided to pack her bags for an audition that would change everything. Once a viral audition. On April 11, 2009, the Clyde Auditorium in Glasgow was packed with an audience that was hungry for a spectacle, but mostly they were hungry to judge. Reality television at the time had developed a pretty cynical edge. The formula was simple: put someone eccentric on stage, let the audience mock them, watch the judges deliver a brutal takedown, and move on to the next act. When Susan Boyle walked out from the wings as contestant number 43212, she seemed to fit that exact sacrificial mold. She was a 47-year-old woman with unstyled, frizzy hair, wearing a plain, slightly dated lace dress. She was chewing gum, hips swaying slightly, carrying a fierce, nervous energy that the cameras immediately caught. The reaction from the room was instant and cruel. The moment Susan introduced herself and announced that she was from a tiny town no one had heard of, audible giggles rippled through the crowd. When Simon Cowell asked her what her dream was, and she confidently replied that she wanted to be a professional singer as successful as West End legend Elaine Paige, the stadium practically erupted into collective eye rolls. The camera panned to teenage girls in the crowd openly scoffing, and Simon shared a famously dismissive side-eye look with fellow judge Piers Morgan. To the thousands of people watching live, Susan wasn't a contender. She was a joke, a brief moment of comedic relief before the real talent showed up. The air in the room was thick with prejudgment, a toxic blend of ageism and superficiality. Then, Susan closed her eyes, took a breath, and the music started. The first notes of I Dreamed a Dream from Les Miserables began to play. Susan opened her mouth, and within exactly 3 seconds, the entire trajectory of her life and the landscape of reality television shattered. The voice that came out of her wasn't weak, timid, or amateurish. It was a rich, soaring, fiercely passionate operatic mezzo-soprano that possessed an unbelievable emotional weight. It was a voice that carried the decades of loneliness, the grief of losing her mother, and the pain of being overlooked by a world that didn't care to look closer. The transformation in the auditorium was nothing short of jaw-dropping. The smirks instantly vanished from the faces of the audience, replaced by wide eyes and dropped jaws. Piers Morgan's cynical expression melted into absolute disbelief. By the time Susan hit the first major crescendo of the song, the very same crowd that had been laughing at her just 60 seconds earlier rose to their feet in a massive, deafening standing ovation. People in the audience were openly crying, completely overwhelmed by the sheer beauty of what they were witnessing. Amanda Holden sat with a look of pure, ecstatic shock, later calling it the biggest wake-up call ever. When the song ended, the applause was so loud it shook the room. Susan, almost oblivious to the magnitude of what she had just done, simply turned around and began walking off the stage, thinking her job was done. The judges had to yell for her to come back just to give her their verdicts. 3 enthusiastic yeses followed, accompanied by unprecedented public apologies from the panel. Simon Cowell would later confess that his initial reaction was awful, and that the moment forced him to look in the mirror and realize you truly cannot judge a book by its cover. Susan walked off that stage a triumphant hero, but neither she nor the producers had any idea that the video of those 4 minutes was currently hitting the internet like a tidal wave, racking up tens of millions of views in a matter of days, and turning a quiet Scottish singleton into the most famous woman on the planet overnight. But while the world was busy celebrating this modern fairy tale, the sudden, crushing weight of global obsession was about to push Susan to a terrifying breaking point: the 2009 pressure cooker. The weeks leading up to the Britain's Got Talent live finale were absolute madness. Overnight, Susan Boyle went from an anonymous villager to someone being chased down the street by international news crews. Photographers camped outside her small council house in Blackburn. Demi Moore and Ashton Kutcher were tweeting about her to millions, and Oprah Winfrey was calling her team, desperate to get her on a flight to America. For a woman who had spent 47 years in a quiet, isolated bubble with her cat, this sudden, aggressive loss of privacy was a violent shock to the system. She was trapped inside a high-stakes media hurricane, and the pressure was building to a dangerous peak. Behind the scenes, the stress was visibly cracking her composure. The media, which had initially built her up as a heartwarming fairy tale, began to turn on her, hunting for any sign of erratic behavior. They reported on backstage emotional outbursts and tense interactions with hotel staff, painting her as unstable rather than overwhelmed. The pure, joyful innocence of her first audition was entirely gone, replaced by a grueling schedule of rehearsals under the watchful, critical eye of the entire world. Susan was no longer just a contestant. She was a global commodity carrying the weight of massive commercial expectations. By the night of the live grand finale on May 30th, 2009, an estimated 400 million people worldwide were tuned in, all expecting her to walk away with the crown. Her main competition was Diversity, a highly synchronized, wildly energetic street dance troupe from London. Susan took the stage and delivered a powerful, defiant rendition of I Dreamed a Dream, but the raw vulnerability that had defined her first appearance felt heavy with exhaustion. When the voting blocks closed and the hosts prepared to announce the winner, the tension in the studio was suffocating. Then came the shock that no one saw coming. The hosts announced that Diversity had won the public vote, leaving Susan Boyle in second place. The studio fell into a stunned, uncomfortable silence. But instead of breaking down on camera, Susan showed incredible grace. She began to clap, hips swaying in a repeat of her famous audition dance, and told the hosts that the best guys had won, wishing the young dancers nothing but the best. On television, she looked like a resilient, good sport, But the moment the cameras stopped rolling and she retreated backstage, the immense pressure cooker of the past 2 months completely shattered her. Within 48 hours of the finale, Susan collapsed from sheer emotional and physical exhaustion at her London hotel. Her team recognized that she was in a state of severe crisis, entirely unequipped to process the trauma of the whirlwind experience and the sudden loss. Emergency services were called, and Susan voluntarily checked into the Priory, a private psychiatric clinic in London. The public was horrified, suddenly realizing the immense human cost of the entertainment machine they had been consuming. Susan spent days in the clinic under close medical supervision, away from the flashing cameras, simply trying to recover her breath and find her footing in a world that would never be normal again. Yet, just when critics predicted her breakdown would signal the end of her short-lived career, Susan walked out of that clinic and straight into the record books. Boyle's albums and global conquest. When Susan Boyle walked out of the doors of the Priory Clinic, the skeptics were already writing her professional obituary. The prevailing narrative in the music industry was that she was a viral novelty act, a flash in the pan, whose fragile mental state would prevent her from ever enduring the grueling demands of a real recording career. They assumed her second-place finish on television would translate to a swift, quiet return to anonymity. But Simon Cowell and his record label Psycho knew they were sitting on a cultural phenomenon. They quickly moved her into a secure private studio environment, pairing her with world-class producers who understood that the key to Susan's success wasn't flashy pop production, but the raw, unvarnished emotional depth of her storytelling. In November 2009, she released her debut studio album, appropriately titled I Dreamed a Dream. What happened next didn't just defy industry expectations, it completely rewrote the history books of modern music. The album exploded into the global market like a commercial tidal wave. In the United Kingdom, it sold over 411,000 copies in its very first week, instantly becoming the fastest-selling debut album by a female artist in British chart history. Across the Atlantic, the American market embraced her with an almost unprecedented fervor. I Dreamed a Dream debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200 chart, moving over 701,000 copies in 7 days. A feat that outperformed industry titans like Eminem, Beyoncé, and Whitney Houston. For a 48-year-old woman who just months prior was surviving on basic government assistance, the numbers were staggering. Susan wasn't just selling records, she was single-handedly propping up a struggling physical music industry during the peak holiday shopping season. The momentum didn't slow down as the album went on to sell over 10 million copies worldwide, earning multi-platinum certifications in dozens of countries. Susan became a global ambassador of hope, proving that an audience tired of auto-tuned teenagers was starving for genuine, heartfelt talent. Determined to prove that her initial success wasn't a fluke, her team rushed her back into the studio to prepare a follow-up project. In November 2010, exactly 1 year after her debut, she released The Gift, a beautifully melancholic holiday and spiritual album. The release achieved a historic milestone that placed Susan in the company of musical royalty. She secured the #1 spot on both the UK and US album charts simultaneously for the second time in less than a year. The only other act to achieve that specific double-chart double crown within a 12-month period was the Beatles. Over the next several years, the commercial engine around Susan Boyle kept running at an unbelievable pace. She released a steady stream of successful albums, including Someone to Watch Over Me, Standing Ovation, and Home for Christmas, each accompanied by a massive promotional machine that flew her to talk shows in New York, television specials in Tokyo, and grand performance stages across Europe. She was suddenly generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, transforming from a village singer into a powerhouse corporate asset. Yet, while the music industry executives were celebrating the historic profit margins and pop music analysts were dissecting her cross-generational appeal, a much quieter, deeply personal struggle was playing out behind the scenes regarding how this ordinary woman would handle the sudden reality of becoming an accidental multimillionaire. Because while her voice was conquering the global charts, Susan's everyday reality was about to pull her back toward the simple, modest life she had always known. The private world of an accidental millionaire. By the time the dust settled on her initial global conquests, Susan Boyle was sitting on a personal fortune estimated at over $22 million. For anyone, that kind of overnight wealth is a massive shock, but for a woman who spent 48 years meticulously counting pennies and surviving on basic government welfare, it was an entirely alien universe. The entertainment industry is full of stories of sudden millionaires who immediately buy fleets of sports cars, designer wardrobes, and sprawling mansions in Hollywood. But Susan Boyle was never a product of the entertainment industry. She was a product of Blackburn. Her relationship with her newfound millions would turn out to be just as unconventional, grounded, and fiercely stubborn as her rise to fame. Initially, her team tried to get her to live the life of a global superstar. Under their advice, she purchased a beautiful 5-bedroom luxury villa worth over $300,000, located in a posh, upscale development on the outskirts of her hometown. The house was modern, spacious, and secure, exactly what a high-profile celebrity was supposed to want. But Susan hated it. She felt completely displaced in the quiet, sterile luxury of the new neighborhood. She couldn't sleep. The vast empty rooms felt isolating, and she deeply missed the familiar sounds and faces of her old street. Within a matter of months, she made a decision that baffled industry insiders. She moved right back into her modest, semi-detached childhood council home, the very same house where she had cared for her mother and spent decades in isolation. Instead of selling the luxury villa, she simply gifted it to a family member and went back to the place where she felt safe. She paid the local authority to buy her childhood council home outright, and then spent a modest amount of money remodeling it. But even the renovations were incredibly telling. She didn't install a home cinema or an indoor pool. She decorated the rooms with simple religious ornaments, framed photos of her parents, a modest piano, and cozy, traditional furniture. To this day, it looks like the home of a typical Scottish grandmother, not a multi-platinum recording artist. Her daily spending habits remained equally unchanged. Tabloid reporters who followed her around, expecting to see her shopping at luxury boutiques in London or Paris, instead found her at the local grocery store, hunting for discounts and using public buses to get around town. She maintained a strict allowance managed by her financial team, famously asking if she could withdraw $30 from an ATM for daily expenses, completely oblivious to the fact that she had millions sitting in the bank. Her only real splurges were incredibly practical: a few nice coats, driving lessons that she ultimately abandoned, and ensuring that her beloved cats were well fed and cared for. However, this massive influx of cash didn't come without serious personal strain. Sudden wealth changes family dynamics, and Susan's family was no exception. For years, rumors swam around the British press about intense rifts and bitter feuds between Susan and some of her siblings over money. There were reports of relatives demanding massive cash payouts, leading to a painful, multi-year estrangement from her brother, Jerry. The pressure of being the family provider, combined with her Asperger's syndrome, made navigating these complex emotional and financial relationships incredibly exhausting for her. The simple life she desperately clung to was constantly threatened by the reality of her wealth. Yet, despite the family dramas and the constant temptation to retreat entirely behind locked doors, Susan realized that the only place she ever felt truly powerful and free from the anxieties of her bank account was under the bright lights of a live stage. This deep need to connect through music is what eventually drove her out of her quiet living room and back onto the global stage for a series of historic live performances. The live stage, concerts, duets, and royal eyes. For a lot of reality TV stars, the journey ends the second the studio album drops, and the initial hype cools down. Actually getting out on the road and delivering a live 2-hour show night after night is where the real work happens, and it's where a lot of internet sensations completely fall apart. But for Susan, the live stage wasn't a chore. It was the ultimate validation. It was the place where she could look her audience in the eye and prove that she wasn't just a studio trick or a passing novelty, but a genuine powerhouse performer who could command a room all on her own.
When she launched her first major solo concert tour, I Dreamed a Dream, the Susan Boyle musical, and subsequent international tours, the energy in the theaters was electric.
These weren't your typical, quiet, operatic recitals. They were highly emotional, deeply personal experiences. Susan would walk out on stage, frequently wearing elegant, glittering gowns, and instantly connect with fans who had traveled from all over the world just to hear her. Her set lists were a beautiful mix of theatrical show tunes, traditional Scottish folk songs, and unexpected pop covers. Between songs, she completely charmed the crowds with her quirky, self-deprecating humor, often cracking jokes about her hair or dancing across the stage with the same goofy, unpolished charm that first made the world fall in love with her. She was a living, breathing reminder that you don't have to be perfect to be extraordinary. As her touring career grew, Susan found herself sharing the stage with some of the biggest names in music history. One of the absolute pinnacles of her career was fulfilling a lifelong childhood dream by duetting with her ultimate musical idol, Elaine Paige. Standing side by side with the exact woman she had mentioned during her very first audition, Susan sang a breathtaking rendition of I Know Him So Well from the musical Chess. She also recorded and performed with legendary pop icon Donny Osmond, forming a deep, mutual friendship that saw them sharing stages across Las Vegas and the UK. To go from singing along to their records alone in a tiny bedroom to sharing microphones with them as an equal peer was a surreal, dizzying transformation. But the stages kept getting grander, and the eyes watching her kept getting more influential. Susan was invited to perform for some of the most powerful dignitaries on the planet. In 2010, she stood before a crowd of over 65,000 people at Bella Houston Park in Glasgow, singing for Pope Benedict XVI during his historic state visit to the United Kingdom. A deeply moving moment for a woman whose faith had always been her rock during her darkest years of isolation. She also caught the attention of the British royal family, performing multiple times for Queen Elizabeth II, including at the Diamond Jubilee pageant at Windsor Castle. Standing in front of royalty, the girl who had once been locked in dark school cupboards by childhood bullies was now a celebrated national treasure, representing the grit and spirit of Scotland on the global stage. Whether she was performing in a massive arena in America, a television studio in Tokyo, or a grand royal palace, Susan brought the exact same raw, unfiltered honesty to every single note. The glitz and glamour of international touring never managed to change her core. She remained the unassuming woman from Blackburn, carrying an untouchable gift that could make even the most cynical rooms fall completely silent. But as the bright lights of these massive global tours eventually began to dim, Susan found herself facing a quiet, deeply personal battle for her own survival. A resilient songbird. The story of Susan Boyle isn't a simple fairy tale about a woman who got lucky on a reality television show. It's a messy, beautiful story about survival. When she walked onto that stage in 2009, she didn't just challenge how we view talent. She challenged how we view human value. For decades, the world told her she was too old, too eccentric, and too different to matter. But with a single breath, she completely rewrote the rules of modern celebrity, proving that extraordinary gifts are often hidden in the most unassuming places. She survived a brutal overnight rise to fame that would have easily crushed a far more experienced performer. She navigated the treacherous waters of sudden multi-million-dollar wealth while fiercely holding on to her modesty, her roots, and her childhood home. And when her own body threw its hardest curveball with a devastating stroke, She quietly dug her heels in, fought like crazy in the shadows, and reclaimed her voice on her own terms. Today, Susan stands as a living testament to the power of a promise. She kept her word to her mother, and in doing so, she gave a voice to anyone who has ever felt invisible, mocked, or left behind. The industry tried to consume her. The critics doubted her, and the health scares tried to silence her. But through it all, the music never actually stopped. As she steps confidently into this bold new era of her life, Susan Boyle continues to look the world dead in the eye and prove that it is never, ever too late to dream a dream. Did you vote for her during the finals? For more stories just like hers, just click subscribe and leave your comments below.